there's imposter syndrome right off the bat when you take a new client on. You're like, what do I do? What do I do? Right? Because some people will come with a lot of therapy work underneath their belt already, in terms of they've had therapists prior to coming to me or a colleague of mine. And so sometimes people come in and it's really interesting. They think that they have an agenda and then they'll be like, what do you think I should work on? Like, this is your time. I don't know what you should work on. You
Think
tell
that
me.
you would have the agenda as the therapist?
Mhm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. What do you think I should work on? Right. So sometimes depending on what modality you're using, things could be like, oh, hey, let's set some goals. That's very public insurance based and private, actually, where they're like, we have to set goals and then you have to make smart goals and then you have to meet those goals. But then there's other modalities out there, like, for instance, internal family systems or NARM, which is neuroaffective relational model. Both models look at complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And it starts out with, what do you want for this session? Off the bat, that's your first session. Like, what would you like to achieve out of this session today?
And so is the idea in that approach that each session is going to be unique, that you're going to be tackling a different problem each time, or will there be some carry through in that?
There will be carry through, and a lot of the times they talk about what's going on today. So it's like, hey, Nick, what would you like for yourself out of therapy today? And the thought is that whatever it is that you bring in, these patterns that we have now as adults, they've started when we were children, or whatever trauma had taken place, and then now we're just carrying those patterns through into adulthood. And so even if we started today and I said, oh, what do you want to work on? And you're like, I want to explore my anger. You're like, oh, okay, right? We could start with today, the most recent thing that got you mad today, or you can go back and be like, have you been processing your anger this way since you were a child? Or how far back do you remember this going? And so then you're exploring kind of that entire range now of childhood, today, so it kind of goes all over the place a
You're
little
kind of
bit.
going where the patient needs to go in that moment, in some sense.
Yep. Yeah. In that moment. And I think that's the biggest part with CPTSD. We can be in the moment with them and like really have them feel into themselves, which is a lot of somatic experience. I'm not trained in SE, but a lot of people are, and it's really big right now in trauma-informed care about tapping into our bodies and like, where are we feeling our sadness? Where are we feeling our anger? Whatever it may be, because then we can start chopping up. That's the easiest way to describe it. Start chopping up like what's happening within our bodies. That way, the next time it comes up, we're like, oh, there it is. I mean, it sounds simple right now as I'm describing it, but it actually does take place very quickly. If we don't let our emotions like completely take over, we start to learn skills to stop, chop it up, see what's going on, ask ourselves like, what's coming up? Where am I feeling the sensation? What's the disturbance? And then we kind of proceed from there with whatever skills it is we have, whatever soothing techniques we have, going for a walk, taking my dog out for a walk, just sitting in the sun, whatever it may be, reading my book, taking a deep breath.
Whatever helps.
Whatever helps. And that's really custom, to each person. Like, I've tried a lot of coping skills in the past and I'm like, well, that one doesn't work anymore. I need to find something new, and then you go and you explore that and you have to do the work. That's the thing, right? Because some people will come in and be like, oh, I've been here for like 8 months. And I'm like, well, I've offered you EMDR. You can offer so many modalities that you're trained in. And you find out that people are like, I kind of want to just come in here and have a cathartic experience. I'm like, well, that's the reason why maybe we're not
making any progress.
Yeah, exactly. Because we're doing the same thing. And then when you approach them and say, well, what is it that you want to work on again? Right. And then you get what do you think? And I'm like, I'm thinking, what do you want to work on? Right. This is why I asked you a question. So, but it's fascinating because people get really scared about working through their trauma. I've seen people hyperventilate when they reach a point where they're like, oh, there it is. Like, there's recognition and they're hyperventilating. They're like, I think I'm going to vomit. I'm nauseous. Or they'll go home and they're like, I slept for 12 hours and took 3 days to recover. I'm like, okay, whoa, that's work being done, so it's really fascinating to see people change and then have like physical change as they go through whatever trauma it is that they're working through.
Is that emotional response just in reference to them reliving that trauma in some sense, or is it a fear of going back to that place and just seeing it?
I think it's a little bit of all of it and also a little bit of that, um, like last week I had was it last week? Yeah, I had somebody who just had to stop in 45 minutes into session because they were like I was doing EMDR and they were like, "This is getting too close to change. I see it on the other side." So, it's essentially, I was describing it as, is it like looking through a window and you see it right there? Like, you're in the neighborhood now and it's, like, a little too scary? And it was like, "Yeah." Like, "Okay, I'm okay with stopping here and just kind of debriefing, de-escalating, and then just making the next appointment and going from there." So it's interesting to when you find your modalities as a therapist in terms of what you believe is going to work and you really work it, and then it also can be like an eclectic mix of things. It's fascinating to see people have those big changes to be like, okay, I think it seems I'm doing effective work, and then there are other clients who are like, I don't think I don't know what I'm doing, right?
Yeah, what are we
So
doing here?
yeah, yeah, and so sometimes I'll go in there, I'm like, "Yeah, I know what I'm doing," and then sometimes I'm like, "Mm-mm, no, I think I have to go back to school." Like, who gave me this degree? What happened here? So it does really, it makes me check myself as a therapist, and in one of the modalities I'm training for, which is neuroaffective relational model, I think I mentioned it, NARM, it really forces you to check like, the 50/50, which is, like, what's going on with me and what's going on with my client, right? So being present, like, being split. It's interesting where you're like, "I'm present with myself, but I'm also being present in this environment with them." And so you're definitely scanning yourself and saying, "Okay, I don't think I know what I'm doing now." Right? What next? But usually it I find that it usually flows really well, though. Once you build that rapport with people and you're and being honest, I'm like, "I don't know. I really don't know."
Well,
And
is that a hard part in it? Because they're coming to you for the answers in some sense, right? Or to work through the problem together, but they really want you to know and guide them. And so for you to say, I'm not really sure. We're going to just see what happens here.
that people are okay with that's exactly what I say. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens in the next session. Let's see what happens throughout the week or the 2 weeks, depending on how often I'm seeing somebody. I'm like, go collect some data. We need some data, right? Because some people are like, I don't know if I know what it feels like to be, peaceful within my body. I'm like, oh, okay. Let's see if it comes up, and if it does come up, can you, like, come back with some info for me? Sometimes you'll try to tap into it, within the session, and they're like, "I can't." And I'm like, "That's okay." Right? So that means right now we have an unknown, but I feel like sometimes I usually tell people, I feel like we're in the neighborhood of something, right? And so there's a lot of excavating to really get to the core of what's going on with people, because a lot of times, um, coping skills are great. I think they're fantastic for the time being, like when we're in the throes of whatever emotions we're having. But I think we also have to get to the core of what's going on, right? This is where that trauma informed care comes in to really get to like the roots of like our cognitive patterns and our behavioral patterns of like what is happening or what happened to us, right? Because I have a lot of clients coming in, they'll like, be like, there are these 4 things wrong with me. I'm like, "I don't think that's a problem." Right? "I'm depressed." "I don't think that's a problem. What happened there?" Right? And so, I mean, there's a book that Oprah Winfrey and his name? Bruce Perry. He's a psychiatrist. They wrote a book called What Happened to You. And it's great because it talks about, well, let's start looking to see like what happened to you, what happened to the generation before you. And if you're lucky enough to know 2 generations before that, and then, even more so down the line of ancestry, and to see, wow, is there a pattern going on here? And then you get into epigenetics of trauma that's passed down, so multi-generational trauma, trauma within the womb, and how that impacts babies who are born. And so that's really interesting about how trauma just gets carried over from generation to generation.
Is that the root cause of a lot of what people are dealing with when they come to see you is just in one way or another, it's tied to some trauma that they experienced?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even when people have secured attachments, in their childhood, in their homes, it's really interesting because then we talk about external trauma. Like, for example, I don't know, like, random example, like, oh, I had a really secured household growing up. I went to um, gymnastics at age 14 and was, sexually abused by the coach, right? And so now you've got an external trauma, and then they're like, what do I do with this? Because the household is so secure, and then there's a lot of shame going into this. And so a lot of times people are like, I don't get it. It's not developmental, like the trauma that I experienced. So what is it? Right. And so then again, you're like, well, what happened? But usually it is, I mean, there's usually a lot of developmental trauma, things that happen in the home that then gets repeated into the next generation. And I think that people who come to therapy, they're super brave because they're willing to say, I think, well, usually they say, I think there's something wrong. And I'm like, no, I think something happened. Right. But then they're noticing that they want change, even though they may not know what the change is, and they say, "Well, you tell me," at times, right? Um, they're really brave because they're willing to notice there's an issue they wanna work on, and then when we get into it, I'm like, "Well, you're willing to break some sort of cycle that has happened here, right? You're basically throwing a rock into this whole scenario, and you're willing to jump off the hamster wheel." So, 1, give yourself credit for that. Right? To just not repeat the cycle. I get a lot of older people that come in and they're like, but I've already repeated it for so long. And I'm like, I don't care if you're 93 coming in for therapy. You're still looking for quality of life and calm and peace within yourself, and then from there, a lot of times, right, hopefully there's that self compassion piece, which then, we'll have more compassion with like, people outside of us. I mean, that's my hope.
Well, just because you're on that hamster wheel right now doesn't mean you have to continue to stay on it. Even if you are 90 or you're 50, just because maybe you've lived X amount of time on it, you can still get off and then
Right.
enjoy the remaining time. It doesn't have to be this all or nothing thing where, well, I've already gone this way through life, so I might as well just suffer a little bit more because it's all I know. It's all I've
Yeah.
done.
And it's familiar. And oddly, that uncomfortability, even though well, it's familiar, which makes it comfortable, even though the situation is uncomfortable. It sounds really weird, and sometimes I'll have to say it, like, 10 times in session. I'm like, "Does that make sense? Like, this is familiar to you, and this is why it's comfortable." But it's actually really uncomfortable, right? I think I hear a lot of the times, or even when we watch movies and we're like, "Oh, no, why did that woman go back with that guy in domestic violence situation," right? And it's a lot of times it's because they're familiar with that type of abuse or whatever it may be, and so they're like, "Well, like you said, I've gotten this far already, just a little more, you know, um, it's fine." And I'm sure that's not the process that goes down in the head, but, like, at the time, but when you sit down with somebody and they're like, "Yeah, that is kind of the thought process somewhat that I got this. I've already been through it for 15 years. It's
It's
okay."
almost the devil you know
Mhm.
mentality of, well, yeah, I'm suffering, but what if I work through this problem and then I end up worse in some way? So I might as well just keep doing what I'm doing because I know it. I'm comfortable in it. I know how it plays out. I'll just stay in this path.
Right, 'cause the unknown is a little too scary, right? Which then causes a lot of anxiety and
Even though there's the
stressors.
potential it could be better,
Mhm.
people still like to stay in the comfortable, uncomfortable misery.
Correct, yeah. And then so then you go from there and you're like, "Oh, okay, hold on, there's a little bit of a pattern here. What's going on?" Right? With the cognition, with the actual, like, behavioral part, and then, of course, the, "Well, what's happening here?" part, right? Because then all of a sudden people who are in domestic violence situations I find that I've worked with, will then have children, and then there's shame, right? And then now you've got more layers on top of that, and you're like, "Wow, this is a lot to, work through," and it's okay. It makes a lot of sense. It's not uncommon. That's the saddest part. When I see a lot of people, I'm like, "Wow, this is so actually common that we have suffered so much," and I don't care, how old you are, what color you are, what sexual orientation, what gender. there's just so much trauma in this world, and it's really hard to it's not hard for me to sit through it, but sometimes when you can't kinda take a step back, you're like, "Whoa, it's everywhere." This is really sad. Not I wouldn't say scary is the word because 'cause I'm still out in the world doing this, right? But it's really sad, and then I've traveled to a lot of countries, and I see it there, but I also see it in a different way that I'm like, "Wait, people are still striving for happiness at the same time. Hold on, right? How do we do this? Where's this balance?" And so that's sometimes that's kind of a breath of fresh air. That's why I like to leave the country a little bit and come back and be like, "Oh, okay, hold on, I could do this again,"
The
right?
world's not falling apart. We're
Right,
gonna be okay.
right.
Everything's gonna pan out. It's just there's some darkness
Mhm.
intertwined in all of this.
Yeah, yeah. I will give credit to I think it's the World Health Organization. I forget what year was this, 2018 was it, that they officially, made complex post-traumatic stress disorder a diagnosis. In my realm of, using the DSM-5, through the American Psychology Association, it's not a diagnosis yet, which is unfortunate. I wish it is a diagnosis because a lot of times, um, I have to diagnose people with PTSD, and I'm like, "It's not fitting." You know? It's not. I also don't even like to diagnose people with depression and anxiety because 'cause I'm like, "No, this is all because of post-traumatic or a CPTSD or PTSD," right? Because 'Cause you're like, "Hold on, there's depressive symptoms and anxietal symptoms that comes with PTSD because that's your life being threatened at that point when you think PTSD, right? Complex, it's your life wasn't being threatened, but there's a lot of other things going on. So people can be diagnosed with both CPTSD and PTSD. And those are, and those are all still relatively new diagnosis or diagnoses at this point.
Do you think that that's underlying a lot of those prescriptions, especially in terms of depression, is that there might be some trauma? It's not just this depressive state that they find themselves in?
Yeah, usually it's like when you do some digging, it's like I always see this as like excavating. I'm like, "Oh, we're in the neighborhood." And then you go further and you're like, "Oh, this is not just I've got depression and I can't get out of bed." You talk more and more and you find out trauma is really at the bottom of this. And then what kind of trauma, right? Developmental, religious trauma is a really big one, like cult trauma, people who've left cults, cultural trauma, racial trauma, you know, uh, sexual orientation, gender.
For those, is it attached to that suppressive nature of it? That's where the trauma comes from? That your who you are is being suppressed in some regards, or your a belief system being imposed on you?
Not necessarily. A little bit of that, but sometimes it's also like just the things people have experienced. So the
So the harm that might have been
Mhm.
oh, okay,
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
result of being a part of that in
Right,
some way.
right. Yeah. It's really fascinating. It's pretty complex, it but it also isn't. I mean, it's really weird the way that I see it in my head. I'm like, "Okay, this is like there's a lot." But then I'm like, "Hold on, but some of these techniques and modalities we use can be really helpful." And if it's just the same 2 that we use, like EMDR, for example, right? That's really good for I have 2 different trainers that will say 2 different things. So, when I did EMDR, I had an EMDR trainer, but then I'm currently a neuroaffective relational model, uh, NARM, and the NARM therapist is like, "Well," the trainer's like, "Well, that's really more PTSD." And then my EMDR therapist is like, "Anything disturbing." And I kinda see it kind of in between. I'm like, I think I could use EMDR for a little bit of both, just depending on the person, you know? It is a little more difficult if it's not single case incident PTSD. For example, my dog died kind of thing, or grief and loss is great for EMDR. But when you talk about more bigger, repeated traumas, it is really hard to use EMDR. It's not impossible. I just find it kind of difficult because there's so many layers and so many channels. And so, some people might be able to maybe summarize all those little channels and say, "You know what? It's this person's face and the abuse that I suffered at this person's hands." And you're like, "Oh, hold on." I think I usually call it the boss. I'm like, "You got to the boss." Then we'll go and get the boss and you're like, "Whoa," like 8 sessions later, you're like, "We're getting closer." And you see a change in them too, where they're like, "Wow, exhausted or I'm nauseous or, right, I had to rest getting into my car after this. And I'm like, "Oh, you could have rested in my office." Like, I didn't realize it was, this, EMDR or whatever it was, you know, had this reaction from it afterwards.
So for people that are experiencing depression as a result of some trauma that they may or may not recognize, is the only way to really work through that to address or discover the trauma? I mean, are antidepressants effective in that case, or does the extent vary?
Yeah, the extent varies. I've seen very little progress with SSRIs, with antidepressants, at least in my time. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a medical doctor or PA or NP, but I've been in this field for a really long time in this community. I've worked with youth, I've worked with veterans, I've worked with aging population, and now I'm moving back into more of like younger adults and first generation children of immigrants. And I've seen people take antidepressants after antidepressants, and I'm like, they're like, this isn't working, or I've gained too much weight, and some people will be like, I've been on this for 3 years. I'm like, have you noticed a change? And like, no. I'm like, you might want to go talk to your doctor because it doesn't sound like it's working. Then if we're on year 3 and we're still talking through this, right? Because I feel like SSRIs, it just kind of covers up those symptoms if it works. It doesn't really get to the core of what the issues are at
And
that
that's if
point.
it works. And that's
Yeah,
not to talk about the side effects that you might get
right.
from it working.
Yeah. I mean, off the top of my head, if I had to guess, based on just the people that I have seen and that I've known to take SSRIs, I don't even feel like it's more than 50% that SSRIs have been effective, and this is me just kind of really quickly cataloging through my head from the time I moved here 17 years ago to now, that I'm like, I couldn't even tell you it was 50%. I couldn't tell you what the exact number is, but definitely not 50%. I feel like a lot of the times in therapy, we'll talk a lot about, we do a lot of discussion of meds as well. And a lot of times it's always, I recommend you talk to your psychiatrist, right? But they'll tell me about how it may not be working, or they'll tell me how, hey, I've been on this for like 6 years and it just hasn't worked, or whatever it may be. And I'm like, okay, I'm suspecting that it's also not working, but I also can't tell you to stop taking it. You're going to have to go talk to a doctor. Some people will just off the bat stop and tell me, and I'm like, there's nothing I can do. I don't force people to take meds, but I'm like, you should really talk to your psychiatrist, which is also an issue up here because we don't have that many psychiatrists.
Yeah, the 60-year thing freaks me out because I know a lot of people that are just it's just something that they assume they have to be on forever. That, "Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm on these antidepressants, and now this is just my life."
Right.
Like, we try to dial it in. Sometimes you start out with one, and then you have to go through a couple to find a good mix, and then that's it. This is just now a pill that you take indefinitely,
Right.
which is kind of scary because are we just masking the problem? Like, we're just gonna put a Band-Aid over it, and then now it's okay. Now you pop your pill and then go about your day. You
Yeah.
just repeat that cycle every day.
Right. And for those that where SSRIs do work, it's great. That's wonderful. I'm like, good, something worked. But people will still come in for therapy, and then it's kind of nice because you're like, oh, okay, so this is how I want to feel. And you're like, oh, okay, let's see if we can get there on a therapeutic level. And then you can talk to your psychiatrist about maybe like tapering off. And that would be really nice, right? As you know what you want to feel like with the help of this SSRI that does work. And then we work through whatever issues and trauma it may be to then hopefully taper people down. And then you can hopefully, your body will organically kind of understand what's going on once trauma is processed. And then the hope is then you go about your life processing emotions as they come up and giving it the space and time, right? Learning these skills, learning that I can feel this way. I'm just having emotions and that's okay. I'm just in my feels, but I can regulate it, as I like to call it. Like, and I was just mentioning that to a friend who was in town, and we were talking about psychedelic assisted therapy. And I'm actually going into a training for it in September down in San Francisco, but it'll be online. But he's been doing psychedelic assisted therapy out of state. And it was interesting because he was like trying to explain it. I was like, what you're trying to say is you could be in your feels and then but you regulate it." And he's like, "Yes, that's exactly how I feel." And I told him, I was like, "Well, I'm able to say that because I too have been on, psychedelic assisted therapy. I was for a while, and then now I'm not, but just through a local coach here." And, and definitely they were microdoses and it was great. I didn't like accidentally macrodose at any point in time because then it's no longer, the therapeutic effects you're looking for at that point.
Yeah, the depression thing is interesting because how much of that is a general state of just chaos versus circumstantial of, oh, your life kind of sucks right now, understandably, or you're going through some hardship, and so you are feeling depressed, but you don't necessarily have that constant state of depression. And I worry that, people feel sad and then because of society or because of however we're programmed or whatever, the instinct is I need to take something to fix this. And that's my only solution. Not, oh, maybe I should exercise a little bit. Maybe I can talk to somebody
Mhm.
and try to figure out why I'm feeling this way so that I can work through that. It's nope, take your pill and you can keep going about your day. You're going to feel better. You just have to do this thing first.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because, like, you're right, the circumstantial, situational, or in the world of if I had to give it a, diagnosis, right, it would be adjustment disorder, and so you're trying to adjust to something. Housing, for example, is a really big one.
COVID. I
Yeah,
mean, just the
yeah.
state of COVID, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how many
Mhm,
people were depressed not because of anything, not because of any trauma per se, but because of the state of COVID
mhm.
and how hectic that was.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of people trying to reintegrate all of us, actually, try to reintegrate into society. Maybe I'm not having it because I was already in the throes of society when COVID was happening. I was at the time investigating elder abuse, so I was in people's homes wearing respirator, and so I think I maybe didn't have that that transition back into society. I was like, oh, I've always been out here doing my thing, right? And then when people come in, I'm like, oh, hold on, because I didn't experience that part, right? I'm like, hold on, this is a theme here. And it's true, the circumstances or the situational depression, like people do find that they're like, I don't know what to do, right? How do I process these emotions that are coming up, depressive symptoms, because I'm learning how I don't have friends anymore. All the friends that I had are also hiding out, right? Because they aren't quite ready to come back out yet, or whatever it may be. At least when we're opening back up, But it's fascinating to watch people also, especially like with housing or with COVID, if it's situational. When they find that housing, they're like, "Oh, I'm good. I think I'm great." And so you're like, "No, you've always had those skills. You just had some hardship." Right, that was circumstantial. It's situational. With COVID, I feel like there's a lot of us kind of on the other side now that we're like, okay, we're thriving and we know how to socialize again, right? I mean, today is our first Friday night market in Eureka, right? So clearly we're, going back out. I mean, I was wearing my mask for a really long time up until I think I still do from time to time. I ran out of masks yesterday and I was like, what do I do? What like, I was like a little frantic and I was like, I gotta drive home and get some of these, right? And so um, but most of the time I'm like, oh, I like walk into Costco, I'm like, there's literally 3 people wearing a mask. And then I'm like, "Should I mask for them?" Right? Because it's all about, it's because I do think about the community a lot. I'm like, "Okay, where have I been recently?" I really haven't been anywhere but work, so I think I'm okay.
With a client that comes in and it's a situational depression or situational form of depression, is part of your approach to try to I mean, can you recognize that when you're talking to them that it might just be situational? Are you trying to walk them to some sort of realization in that way? Or you just kinda handhold them and then hope that maybe they come across that epiphany on their own?
So it kind of depends because some people will come in and just be like, "I don't have housing." And you're like, "Oh, okay." Right? And sometimes there are some layers underneath that, or they're like, "I don't know how to socialize anymore because of COVID." And you're like, "Oh, okay." And then you kind of dig back a little bit with them too, to then find out there's always been underlying social anxiety, or there's always been some kind of underlying something, right? That all of a sudden, how come we couldn't like launch ourselves back out of this kind of whatever, maybe however it is we're processing, right? And so there are times that people come in for one thing that's situational. Um, for example, grief and loss. Again, my dog died, right? And all of a sudden I find out that I'm a terrible processor of grief and loss because I hadn't processed like the death of my grandma from 12 years ago. And I'm like, okay, there's something bigger here that I'm not, I just couldn't put my hands on at the time, you know? And so I do have people who come in and then you're like, oh, actually there's a couple layers of, um, going a couple layers down, there's developmental trauma, there's whatever trauma it may be. So I get a mix of both that people come in for more of the short-term therapy, and then they're there for a little longer. Even after the situation is, resolved, then they'll continue to come in to be like, "Okay, I think I need some insight on some other stuff," right? Usually I try my best not to give advice because that's the whole idea. I'm not here to give advice, but definitely ways of looking at things, right? Like different ways of seeing our situation. Because sometimes people just think it's black or white. I'm like, hold on, there's this whole middle area of gray that we haven't even looked at, right? All these other options that are sitting right there, but we're not seeing because we are having a really hard time. Our emotions are maybe clouding, the ability to make decisions, to see other options, whatever it may be. And so people will then be like, "Oh, hold on, can I come in a little bit, like a little for just several more sessions now that even though I've resolved this other issue?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." So I get a mix of, the situational and then underlying other trauma.
And in your approach to handling those, do you try to take a more passive role? Do you kind of poke and prod and maybe press when it's needed, or what is your personal approach in that?
It kind of depends on the person.
And if they can kinda handle that?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do maybe because I'm also in all these different trainings now that I'll use kind of an eclectic approach. If we're talking and let's just say we're doing a very basic like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, changing the way you think to change the way you feel. I'm not there to change anyone's way of thinking. You can think the way you want to think, but I'll offer other options and alternatives. And with those options and alternatives, you then might find out like people start disclosing other information and they're like, "Oh, hold on, I forgot about this." And you're like, "Oh, hold on, that's a round of EMDR." So we basically the next session we're like, "Pause, EMDR." Right? Or, most recently I'm thinking of one where we're about to do EMDR and then we paused and went into more of neuroaffective relational model where I'm just like, "Oh, what are you wanting for yourself?" And when we got to the core of it, I was like, "Wow, that is a totally different thing than last week." Like completely different, It could go from literally like talking about, whatever type of trauma it may be, like, oh, racial trauma. And then you're like, oh, actually, we're over here talking about, you know, um, sexual trauma that happened or like developmental trauma. And you're like, oh, okay. So now we're just going to fork over here. And so I always see therapy as like just a little roadmap where I'm just like, if this go this way, if that go this way, especially depending on the client, if we can customize it to the person that's sitting in front of me. And the hope is that I know them really well now at this point. That and then sometimes people will put up really good boundaries and be like, "I don't think I can go there." Like, "That's fine. We don't have to." Then we'll, look at something else. We'll take this other road, other things you've presented. And so I think memory and bookmarking people's past or things that they tell you is really important too, because I'll just be like, "Oh, we can go this other way. 5 sessions ago you told me this." Or like, "How do you remember that?" Like, I wrote it down somewhere. And when I wrote it down, I remembered, or I'll be like, "In that first session, you had mentioned you also wanted to work on this. And then so we'll go that way if something becomes too intense, and or try to work through that intensity a little bit. But some people will just be like, "I can't. I don't, not necessarily can't, I can't right now." And I'm like, "Yeah, I could respect that."
Do they normally circle around eventually?
They do.
There's just an initial hesitation of, "I'm not quite ready to
Yeah.
dive into where this is gonna go."
Right, yeah, at least with my clients, I've seen a theme where when there's recognition, it's almost like the emoji that has, like, the blow up the fire out of the head kinda thing, and they're like, "Whoa, okay, hold on, I need to stop right there." Right? Because the recognition is already so much. Because I always ask clients, and I ask, my friends and family this too, I'm like, "Okay, we might know something, but do we know it, like, in our hearts?" Right? Like, I'll share some personal information, like, I have a little bit of an anger issue, right? And so and I know this, but then do I know it? But I've recently been knowing it because I've been using these modalities that I've been learning about on myself, And so now I'm really feeling through my anger when it happens, the whys, what took place for me to feel this way before secondary emotions come in. If I can stop it, I don't have to, like, anger can lead to irritability and rage, right? These other secondary emotions. So I'm like, hold on, if I can check my anger, I don't even have to go there, which has been kind of nice. I don't have to go there. I can actually be in my anger and still be really kind and express as to why I'm angry. And that part I'm still working on is that expression of like, I'm upset and this is why, but feeling it, oh, I absolutely can. And I'm like, oh, there it is. Now I have to figure out how to like get it out in a kind way. I don't have to be, I don't really have to be nasty about it when I'm angry. It's like there is a way you can have these what's called negative emotions and still express it in a very graceful manner.
Well, that's a healthy perspective to have. I think it's incredibly challenging for people to try to get into that mindset, particularly because it takes a lot of work.
Mhm.
And that's something that people have a little hesitation towards sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, it's taken just in that example I gave you, it's taken me a year and a half. I started that anger journey in December of 2022. And so here I am being able to just feel into it and still trying to figure out how to express it in a kind way. And I feel like it's that won't even be the end at that point. It's like, okay, the next thing after that, right? And then also then you have to maintain it. So you're like, okay, how do I maintain it? And then not so much the fear, but then the expectation that maybe some of these tactics I have or skills that I have might wear out and they may no longer be helpful. And then I have to find a new way of how to express my anger in a kind way again. And so it's tricky. And once again, it's work and we have to put in the work to then really get somewhere. And like I said, people coming in already doing work and is already saying, I need to jump off this wheel. But they're on the wheel still for a little bit, even though you're trying to get them off and you're like, come on, let's get off the wheel. And they will in session. And then you kind of catch them and you're like, did you just hear what you said? And so there is this part where you also have to be really, you have to be really present because people will start talking really fast and then you'll be like, hold on, you just said something. Keywords are really huge for me. I'm like, I don't know if you heard yourself. Just say this part. And they're like, no. We're like, oh, let's back up. So it's really interesting when people are just, saying things. And then as they're saying it too, it's like, this is where that somatic experience stuff that I'm doing is coming into play, which is like, wait, how are you feeling when you're saying that? Right. Because when we describe a certain situation, let's just say it's a scary situation, we kind of get scared. Or if it's a situation where it made us upset, we kind of get upset, or we're describing a time when we went on a vacation. You're like, oh, that was so nice. And I was so happy. And then you become happy as you're describing it, right? So you're kind of in those feels at the time. And so you're able to catch them and say, well, what are you feeling right now as you're telling me this story? And they're like, oh, okay. you know? Yeah, there's the anger. Oh, okay. I'm getting kind of stressed out telling you this. And people will say that because at the end of sessions, we'll be like, okay, what do we need to do to bring you back down? How do we get you back into this room? If it's telehealth, how do we get back to the room you're in right now? And so there's a lot of this like debrief, decompress. I get people to just like put their feet back on the ground, to just be like, oh yeah, I'm here. So there's quick little, tactics you could bring in that takes like 30 seconds, if that, 10 seconds to be like, oh, I'm back here, And so it'll be like, look for 3 orange things in this room, right? It'd be like that cord and that skateboard or that journal right there or whatever, And so it helps a lot of times to just really quickly bring them back down and then they can go.
And your thought process in that is to kind of just pull them back in and
Mhm.
reground them after whatever you had just been talking about.
Right. Right. Because it's funny because sometimes when I do EMDR, um, within an hour or at least like within 50 minutes, I will feel like I like went on a 5-mile run. Like you'll see me go
It's that
Oh,
draining even for you as the one applying it.
sometimes, right? Because I'm sitting there waving this wand and it's all witchcrafty looking, right? Because I'm like, okay, follow this wand. But as you're doing it and the person is, and these emotions and these thoughts are coming up very quickly, anger, sadness. And then the idea is you go from childhood perspective to adult perspective. And when they're in that adult perspective, you're like, whoa, all these thoughts we just went through, right? Most people tell me when we do EMDR, it took me 5 years to go through each of these emotions that just flashed before me within the last 25 minutes. And I'm like, yeah. And then by the time I'm done, I'm like, oh, like I'll sit back and then we end up doing like a debrief or whatever it may be. And I'm like, we just did some serious like acrobats. And people are like, yeah, I feel it, And so it's really fascinating how certain modalities, especially EMDR, and in this instance that we're talking about, can be very exhausting for me as a therapist because I'm just like, well, we did work. You know what I mean? I'm like, that was like personal training, but for like your behavioral health. Yeah, that was awesome. And so they feel great, you feel great, and you just like high five your way out of there because you're just like, yeah, you did good work. And they were like, you guided me in a really good direction. And so you're like, yes, once again, we're doing, work for the community and people's lives. And that one was positive. Sometimes I come out of sessions where I'm like, nothing happened, which I'm okay with now too. Cause I think when you're striving for something to happen, then imposter syndrome comes to play because you're like, I have done nothing. That means I know nothing, right? And you're like, no, it's because someone chose to have a really cathartic experience. I have clients that will come in and just be like, can I just have a dumping session today? I'm like, okay, if that's what you're requesting, yes, but then you'll still try to like weave certain things in, just depending on what it is, that they're bringing in. But a lot of times when they're trying to dump, they're the same exact patterns and behaviors that we're experiencing from trauma. So it's a trauma response, from whatever may have taken place when we're however old, into today's situation that they want to be like, I want this to be a dumping ground. And you're like, okay. And you're like, oh, hold on. Was this not the same thing? Is this not similar to like what you told me like 3 months ago about the other situation?
Yeah, I'm starting to sense a thread here. Yeah. Can you explain for people that don't know what EMDR is and your process in approaching it?
Yeah. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so it was a modality that was accidentally founded by a woman named Francine Shapiro. She's no longer alive now, but it started in the early 80s, from what I remember. And what it is that so you go through an entire like assessment. So you do a history taking, you kind of teach people about the process of EMDR and what that looks like. And then you do an assessment, you do the desensitization, and then you go through the entire process at the end, and then you do a reevaluation at the next session. And so what it is like the easiest way to summarize it, which one of my really brilliant supervisors at Adult Protective Services, like she was the one that came up with this, is you take away the energy, but you keep the memory. So what it is, it's for memories and incidents that were really disturbing. And so if we're still heightened by, the memory or the incident in terms of like, we give it a lot of energy. And when I say energy, it's like, depressive symptoms, anxiety, if there's a lot of stress surrounding it, then we try to take that down. Can't erase the memory, but the response can be very different. And so the idea is that you have this wand and you go through this assessment. So when you go through the assessment, you ask about the incident or the memory. What's the incident or the memory you want to work on? I'll give you an example. I think I've been bringing this death of a dog in quite a few times because it's easier, right? It's actually it's not easier, but but let's just say I'm like, okay, my memory and incident is death of my dog. And I'm like, okay. And then you say, what's the worst picture of that memory? So what you're doing is you're saying, okay, here I am trying to explain this entire video of my dog dying. And you say, okay, I just want to snip it. What's the worst part of that entire memory? The last look my dog gave me before he died. Okay, and then you go from there and you ask several more questions of like, where do you feel it in your body? How disturbing is it on a scale of 0 to 10? What are the emotions that are coming up? And then the biggest parts are you then give a negative cognition of what you believe about yourself because of the incident. For example, I'm a terrible dog owner. It was my fault that my dog died. And then you want to come up with a positive cognition of what it is you prefer to believe about yourself now based on the incident. Well, I want to believe that it wasn't my fault and that I can have animals, but you'd very simply cut it as it's my fault to it's not my fault, right? And then you go from there. And so then that's when you start the bilateral. And then hopefully people will go from that perspective of, it depends on what comes up. The reason why I use the dog example is because that was what I used when I went into my training for the practicum and I processed the loss of my dog. And I really thought it was my fault, but my dog had a tumor, right? So then I was like, oh, I'm a terrible dog owner. Then I'm like, but I'm really not. I cooked food for my dogs, like, please, right? And so it went from I'm a terrible dog owner and it's my fault my dog died to finally truly understanding I'm not a terrible dog owner whatsoever. And so now if you asked me if I pulled up that incident again, that last look my dog gave me before he died, I can see it right now as I'm thinking about it. And it doesn't really have an emotional effect on me at this point. Before I did it, it did. Like, I was crying all the time. I'm like, "I'm a terrible dog owner, right? How could I let this happen?" And now I'm like, "No." And when it ended, the disturbance level for me was at a 1, which was, like, kind of what's called an ecological one, which is, this is always going to be disturbing. But over time, I've noticed it's not disturbing to me anymore. I've, like, seen it in other lights now as in that adult perspective. And we always fall into both, just because it's childhood perspective is not like I'm insulting somebody and saying, "Oh, you're thinking like a child." Well, it's true. I was kind of thinking in this childhood perspective, very simple, like,
Black and white.
yeah. And then now I'm seeing it. I'm like, oh, I get it, So now there's no energy put into that when that memory comes up. And so that's the whole the thought process of, or that's, kind of like in a nutshell what EMDR is about. Once again, you remove the energy, but you keep the memory.
And so is the thought there that in waving your wand, well, in guiding them into the memory initially, you're kind of re-invoking their emotional response to it. And then in waving the wand, you're trying to split their attention and that somehow separates or neutralizes that emotion for them.
It stimulates both sides of the brain is the thought process. And then so from there, it's supposed to like have a calming effect on you. And then somehow, because with these, however the brain waves are however the stimulation is happening in the brain, and now you have to like call in a neurobiologist with their evidence-based research, right? There's something going on there in terms of electrical, like I think it was like the whatever waves are happening, there seems to be like more understanding, right? Was it today or was it the other day? I'm always looking up like different bilateral stimulations because sometimes people are like, "What do I do?" And because they're telehealth, let's just say, and people are like, sometimes they're like, "What else can I do?" One of the main things that that I was reading about was like watching a tennis match, and I was like, "Oh yeah," because you follow the ball back and forth, and it's like very calming apparently. And then there's another technique that I use along with EMDR called the flash technique, which is founded by Philip Mansfield, and he's down in the Bay Area, and he developed a technique that's tactile. It's a tactile bilateral. So same thing. You can either do the visual bilateral. You could do an auditory bilateral. So for example, these headphones had a back and forth. It kind of does the same thing, and then a tactile one, which you could do like the tapping of your thighs or doing this. And so apparently they all kind of work in the same manner in terms of the impact it has on the brain or the stimulation it has on the brain.
And that bilateral stimulation acts as I mean, it is it a permanent fix for that? Like, it's not an in the moment while you're engaging in the activity or while you're undergoing the treatment that, yeah, your emotional response is kind of separated out. it's a more permanent one that you have to go through this treatment and then you can just carry that through your life that you've kind of progressed through this issue?
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. I've seen it. I like to use the term, let's see if it sticks. Right. So people, let's just say, okay, it took one session to process like, I don't know, like let's just say a car accident, for example. It took one session to process it. And you're like, okay, great. Ooh, off they go, right, for a week. And then they come back and then you do a reevaluation. You're like, okay, how did you feel? Did the memory come up for you at all? When you're driving on the road, did it come up then? And people might be like, yeah, there's some residual. I found myself like flinching, right? As I was, I don't know, driving through the intersection. Then you're like, oh, okay, hold on. That didn't quite work yet. Or they might say like, overall it did, but I'm still doing the flinching, right? Or I'm whatever they may be doing. And so you're like, okay, let's go back. So it seems like it's not completely processed. There are times where people have processed things and then let's just say 20 years later, they'll come back and be like, well, it's back. And you're like, oh, okay. So you just process that again. I've had to do like several rounds for people where you think you got to a 0 or a 1, and they really believe that positive cognition, that more adult perspective, but then they go off for a week or two and they're like, oh yeah, no, that didn't stick. And then so you go back, you do it, you send them off again, and they're like, not yet. Then they just come back in and they're like, okay, this time I think it did, as I'm going about my daily life. So it kind of depends on the person. It also depends on the EMDR therapist. When I was in training, that was a really big deal. Hearing about how other people have been trained as well, or finding other like colleagues or my fellow like trainees were like, oh, I was in a training with this other person, and it didn't. I don't think I learned anything. And so this is why I'm in this one now. And so you're like, oh, okay, so hopefully I'm in the right one, and so it kind of depends on what kind of training is going on as well. Because really EMDR requires like 50 hours of training. I think it is. Was it 50? I think it was 50 hours of training. And so that's quite a bit, and it's mostly practicum. So you're doing EMDR with whoever else is in the training session with you. And so there's a lot of practicing, there's a lot of, then there's the lecture part as well, but it's 50 hours plus, no, it's 40 hours plus another 10 hours of consultation like afterwards. So when you're actually in practice and then you go and consult with another EMDR therapist.
So you're definitely putting in the time to understand the skill.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And while you're waving the wand, are you asking questions related to the incident, or are you kind of trying to bounce back and forth between that happy memory and that bad memory?
So the client is following the wand, and then we're making these comments to keep them present, basically. So it's kind of like, that's good. That's right. Just notice. Oh, that memory's, that's an old memory now. So we don't really at all talk to them. We just kind of keep them present, because it's not, because some people will be like, hypnosis doesn't work on me. And I'm like, this is not hypnosis. I'm not trained in hypnosis. But it sounds to me like hypnosis, you're not even present in the moment, right? But EMDR, you're awake, and then you've got someone making these comments at you that to keep you here present, to be like, it's okay, that's good, right? And then from there, I just stop and I say, why did I forget what I usually say? But I usually say, blank it out and take a deep breath. And then you ask, what came up for you in relation to that memory, right? Because you're sticking with that memory. So when you start bilateral stimulation, after you go through that assessment of like, how disturbing is it? Where are you feeling in your body? Like, what's the negative and positive cognition? You then take these 3 items of the picture that they picked out of that entire memory. That's the most disturbing part. And then you take the negative cognition and then the emotions related to that memory. And you kind of have them put it all together before you start bilateral stimulation. And then so they get it all together in a nice little package, and then they follow your wand. And then from there, you just, after about 25 waves, you then ask, what came up. And so someone might just say, for example, in a car accident situation, they might say, oh, fear, And you're like, just go with that. And then you do another 25 rounds. What came up next? That I'm safe now. Right? That's the hope that like that usually doesn't happen after the third one. I wish it did, but it's usually about, I don't know, 8, 9, or 10 later that they're like, oh, wait, I'm safe now because I'm here. And you're like, go with that. And then you just do another round until they are fully into the adult perspective where they say maybe 3 times, oh, I'm here, I'm present, oh, I'm safe. I'm, I have better insurance, whatever it may be at that point, right? That you then check in with their disturbance level, the 0 to 10. So there's a 0 to 10 disturbance scale, and you say, okay, where are you on the scale of 0 to 10, 0 being not disturbing, 10 being most disturbing. And they could be like a 1. And then you could be like, oh, what still grabs you about this memory? And they'll just say, I'm still driving, and so I'm still a little nervous about it. You're like, okay, just go with that. So you kind of go back to that, and you wave the wand until the next thought, and then you try to get that what's called a SUDS. It's that disturbance level. You try to bring it down to a 0. Now, if it's a really, pretty serious life or death situation that happened and it's very disturbing, sometimes it may not get to a 0, like I was saying, And then you check in with the validity of cognition, which is that positive cognition of like, and that's on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being true, 1 being false. Like how true is, let's just say the positive cognition in a car accident situation is I'm safe. How true does I'm safe feel to you right now? Oh, I know I'm safe. I know I'm a better driver. I know that, right? Whatever skills maybe somebody picked up along the way with driving, right? That they're like, I'm a 7. And you're like, oh, okay. And so if you get that number down to a 0 with the disturbance, and then with the positive cognition up to a 7, the validity of cognition, then you do what's called, you do an installation. So you install that for people to really try to get it in there to be like, I'm safe, or I'm a good driver, whatever it may be, and then from there, the hope is once you install it, and then you do like a quick body scan too. So there is this little bit of a somatic experience in that. So you install all that, and then you send them off. And that's the hope the hope is that it will stay, but if it doesn't, then they just come right back round 2, 3, whatever it may be. Sometimes, certain incidences, like we were talking about before, where, when things are a little more complicated, it does take, 8 to 10 sessions for just one memory, because then you could also end up finding out that it's not the right memory, and you do what's called a float back. You float back to an earlier memory. So then there's all these other pieces to it where you're like, oh, let's float back to an earlier memory where it has the same sensation and same emotions, like within your body and then your emotions. And so someone might be like, oh, age 4, when this took place. And you're like, okay, let's go with that. Let's go with that memory and that incident. And then so you do the full assessment for that, and then you do the bilateral. And then the idea is that if you can find the first and worst incident, which usually the first and the worst are the same. Sometimes they're not, but usually the first incident is the worst incident. That you can then over time, hopefully the idea is that then you can knock the rest of other similar incidents down as well. So let's just say I'm like, I'm trying to use things that are kind of lighthearted, but none of these are very lighthearted, and so it's hard. But let's just say like grief and loss, the death of my grandmother 15 years ago or something like that. And then recent death of, let's just say a sibling or something like that. And you find out, well, hold on, I don't think I processed this over here yet from 15 years ago. It doesn't mean it's going to process the death of your sibling, but what's going to happen is that you might be like, okay, this is less disturbing, and I think I'm still not able to process one that well, but that's fine. Then you just go and you move to this one now. So you can go from like incident to incident, because you can also do what's called, so first and worst, the most current, and then you do future ones too. There could be fear of what if in the future I get into a car accident, if you're on if you're doing a EMDR for a car accident, or the fear of like losing somebody else, right? And so you could do future incidences too. You can also do EMDR with like scary characters like It, and be like, oh, you're scared of clowns. What happened? Well, My mom let me watch it when I was 7, right? And you're like,
That'll do it.
my mom did. I was 9 though, but I'm not afraid of clowns. I was slightly, but not anymore. But it's interesting that then you could be like, oh, okay, let's, go all the way back. Because someone could be like, I have a fear of clowns. That's the most current one. I went to some fair last week and I saw a clown. It freaked me out, right? And then you process that because they're like, I don't remember any other clown incidents. And then this is where you do a float back and you find out, no, mom let them watch it at age whatever, 5. And then you process that first. You check in with the most recent. They're like, no, I'm still a little, the recent one is still kind of scary, even though this one has been processed. And then you process that one. What if I run into a clown again? You process that one, the what if, and so then you could do, and so that means it works really well for phobias as well, right? Of like the first and the worst, the current and the future.
Would a situation where it's death related in the sense that you had your grandma die and then maybe your grandfather died
Mhm.
and then the deaths kind of stack up, would that work with EMDR because it is essentially a localized trauma in the sense that it started with your grandma? I know that you said you can only or you want to use it for localized situations and not recurring ones. What's kind of the balance for that?
So it's interesting, yeah, because I guess because I've got like so many different trainers with so many different backgrounds, right? But like I said, I usually just go with if this is my EMDR trainer, I'm going to go with what this person said, right? Anything disturbing, and so usually if someone brings in, let's just say, didn't process grandma's death yet, grandpa's death was more recent, and once again, people don't always know that they didn't process some other grief and loss in the past. It's not until you're in it with them, even though you try to assess and make sure like this is the memory, so people sometimes just don't recognize it, And so you just start with grandfather first. You're like, "All right, let's go for it." And then in between it all, they might be like, "Hold on, my grandma." And you're like, "Okay, time out." Like just time out, pause. You can actually just take a pause and be like, "We're going to go with that." And you just change the script on that in terms of the assessment.
And that's the bounce back idea, is that
Mhm.
you're kind of working back to the root.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about if you had, say, a veteran who their trauma isn't necessarily localized? Say they've done a couple of tours,
Mhm.
the trauma that is attached with that, they've seen a lot of things. Would EMDR still be a viable option for them where you can't really localize one issue? Or would they be able to localize one problem? Like maybe their first tour, it would just bounce back to that?
It kind of depends on the situation. I haven't done EMDR with a veteran yet, even though I've worked with veterans in the past. But I was actually oddly thinking about this like last week. I was like, like what I was thinking about this. It was like more of a personal matter in terms of a veteran, a family member that I know, my family member. And because his brother was asking me about trauma. And I was thinking about this. I was like, I wonder if I had asked him, is there a very specific disturbing event that took place to start with? You know what I mean? Like, can we go from there in terms of like taking the history? That's where you take the history part. And once again, the history may not be completely accurate at times. And that's where you can kind of switch gears. And that's why it's kind of nice. It's not like, it's not so rigid that you can just like, I must get it the first time, right? It's nice if you can, because then you're not really like, oh, I've like not really wasted sessions, but you're like, man, I could have, if I dug deeper, I could have just, gone from that point on, right? But sometimes you can't because people can't remember. So people usually just go with what they can remember and what they know. And so like let's just say a veteran, they're like, the worst memory that still haunts me, and that's what I always use. I'm like, what's a memory that always like haunts you? And they're like, oh, it's like watching a friend die, like while in combat. And you're like, okay, let's go with that, so you can start there as well, like a little bit of this digging. There's also with history taking to then come up with that incident and that memory. There's also the ACEs score, the adverse childhood experiences. If people are like, okay, on these 10 points, my dad going to prison, right? That's one of them. Have you ever had a family member incarcerated? Is there any alcohol and drug use, right? Early deaths, verbal abuse, emotional abuse. So you can go with that too and use that as your starting point to kind of explore. But I feel like when people come in, they usually know. Like I have people who seek me out for EMDR, but I also have people who are seeking me out for your very common like cognitive behavioral therapy, whatever it may be, and then these incidents come up and you're like, no, time out, EMDR, right? When people are like, I watched somebody attempt to take their life, and you're like, oh, okay, I think this is an EMDR situation, right? Because this is kind of scary. This is a disturbing incident, or I watched a car accident happen. And so once again, you're like, oh, let's process that. It in the world of EMDR, like when you're doing when you're doing the training, there's like what's called low hanging fruit, and it's low hanging fruit is always nice, but it's weird you use the word nice for people's trauma. You're like, that's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah, that's good, right? But it's interesting because people sometimes need that help because EMDR is very like, I was joking with my consultant about this, and I was like, I feel like I'm being really bossy, and she's like, yeah, it's a very like direct. You have to be really direct with people and be like, no, what does it make you? How does it make you feel right now? Right? Because people will go off on their own, and so if you don't pull them back, they're gonna want to float off to another incident that has nothing to do with this one. And you're like, no, I'm talking about this incident again, right? So you do have to like reel them back in. And then you find out maybe the reeling in, you're like, wait, hold on, I'm hearing something different. And then you kind of guide them through that direction. And it's fascinating because then you can also, I was telling you about the flash technique. You can throw that in there too. So there's all these other things that can happen within EMDR. You could throw in the flash technique if people are stuck. Usually people get stuck at around a 4. Disturbance level is at a 4. It's been a 4 for 6 rounds of bilateral, right? And you're like, okay, there's something going on here. What you could do is use the flash technique. People come in already really escalated. The earthquake that happened in December. People are just like, what in the world, right? And so already you can, and then all the aftershocks, you can really quickly just use the flash technique, try to bring them down, continue to use the flash technique, or just go back into EMDR. And then so you could kind of stop in the middle of EMDR, use the flash technique. You also don't even have to go with what people say. Let's just say I'm doing EMDR and you're like, oh, the thought that came up was, and maybe this is not a good example, but let's just say anger or something like that, but usually with anger, you can do squeeze a towel or whatever it may be. Actually, no, a really good example is grief and loss again, the death of somebody. I'm having a really hard time processing this death of grandparent. Okay, if the grandparent was in here, what would they say to you? So you can do what's called cognitive interweaves too. You don't really necessarily have to go with the last thing where they're like, I'm really sad. And you're like, okay, well, how about, what would you say to this person if they were here? And then you do the bilateral as they're talking it through. They're not saying it out loud. They're just, talking it through in their head with whatever they want to say to this person. And then sometimes people are like, I'm not done. You're like, fine, another round of you talking to this person, right? And then you go ahead and go for that. And so there's all these different little tricks and techniques that could then be dropped into EMDR as well.
And the flash technique being, what does that look like?
So the flash technique is you have a positive, engaging memory. Like, for example, let's just say I'm having a really hard time processing the recent earthquakes, right? We keep getting all these aftershocks. And I'm coming in and I'm really escalated. I'm really stressed out. And let's just say I'm like, okay, my positive engaging memory or, topic I want to use is a dog. One of my dogs. I did just have a good time with my dogs. Great. So what I'll do is like, I'll, as the therapist, I'll tell you to start tapping, which is either it's going to be some of this business or you could do some of this stuff. And I'll start asking you questions about your dog. I'll just say, okay, tell me about your dog. What's your dog's name? How old are they? What are some things you do? And so people just start saying whatever it is, right, about their dog. And usually it's happy because it's positive, right? And then from there you say flash. And so I've already given them instructions to flash their eyes 3 to 5 times when I say flash. And it's kind of like, it interrupts people. You're saying it's slightly rude. I feel like I'm like flash, then so they flash real quick. And then we go right back into that conversation. Does your dog, where was your dog from? And did your dogs have any siblings or whatever it may be? And so you just kind of engage with them about whatever topic it is they pick. And you do that for a good, I feel like I usually do it for a good 3 to 5 minutes. And then throughout you're dropping in the flash and then they stop talking, they flash, and then they're 3 to 5 blinks, they go right back in. And then at the end of it, you can, or in between, you can check in and just be like, okay, where's that disturbance? You use that same 0 to 10 scale and say, where is this disturbance now? Right? Because you don't even go into the memory at that point or the incident. It's just kind of hovering over here is what it is. So we've already brought up the disturbing incident, but then we then switch gears to this flash technique, and you have this, positive, engaging, whatever it is that you're bringing in. And so from there, it's just kind of on the peripheral, and then you check in. So how disturbing is the incident of whatever, maybe, the earthquake, that's what we're using. How disturbing is the earthquake to you on a scale of 0 to 10 now? Let's just say I came in and I was like flustered, and I was like at a 9 out of 10. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm at a 6 now. I'll feel better, And then from there, as the therapist, you then decide, do I continue flash or do I go into straight EMDR? And you can also switch back later too. If you're like, ooh, EMDR is not working, you can actually flash through the entire thing if you want to and get it all the way down to a 0 and just be done. I was reading some research about this the other week. And this was just one research, but they found there was no difference between the flash technique and EMDR in terms of positive results. And so EMDR definitely, and they were saying that the clients that they had in this research preferred flash because there's not a lot of this moving the eye. There's not a lot of this engaging with the memory of the disturbing instant. With flash, once again, you're talking about something positive, right? My day at the beach, my vacation to wherever, my children, right? And so when you're engaging and you're talking about something positive, you don't even have to touch that whole I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm whatever it may be at that point. And so there's no positive cognition, there's no negative cognition, there's no, where do you feel in your body? There's none of that. But it is a technique that is either to be added to it. But, as I was going through the training for both EMDR and flash, it was interesting that some people just use straight flash and it works really well as well. So, I like it. Some people think it's weird because there's, you're doing this business and you're talking, right? And I'm doing it with you, right? Or some people do this. And so they're like, this is really weird. I'm like, is that more weird than me doing this? Right. So it's interesting but people come in and they're like, I want to do that again. I'm like, which that? Right. And they're like, I want to do both the EMDR and flash. And so I'm like, oh, okay.
Is the idea behind flash that bilateral stimulation again, or is it's the same process?
And it's tactile now this time, right? Because you're doing this business. And so instead of doing the actual like visual bilateral. And once again, I haven't done any research on the auditory bilateral yet, but I'm going to look into that a little more. That's really interesting.
That's another avenue that you could go down.
In terms of bilateral stimulation. Yeah.
It's fascinating that works. I mean, the brain is so crazy that you can kind of work through some traumatic experience in that way by just going through these cues in some sense.
Right.
And that, we're working through it. We might just be doing something here and it kind of feels silly, but I mean, you're seeing progress.
Right. You're seeing progress very quickly. Like I said, I've had several people tell me it took me X amount of years to go through all those emotions that I just went through in all of 20 to 25 minutes, if not 15 minutes. And people will break it down. They're like, I was depressed for the first 2 years, and then I was upset and depressed for 2 more additional years, right? But then they were like, I was just really sad just now, and then I got really mad, and then I thought I was crazy, right? People always have that one. They're just like, am I nuts? Because I just went through that's exactly what people will ask me. I think I'm crazy. Like in the middle of EMDR, I was like, why? And they're like, because I just went through a bunch of emotions. I'm like, no, that's common. That's just human. Like we hold multiple emotions at the same time at times, right? And people are like, oh yeah, okay. And so then you continue on, and so it's really, it really does yield results very quickly. I'm pretty amazed. If you asked me 12 years ago, I was like, EMDR, what? This is weird. Because I read about it 12 years ago and I was like, I don't know, it's kind of witchcrafty, And then what in the world made me even decide to take it? Take the course? I don't remember. Oh, I think I was I want to do this because there's not that many EMDR therapists here in Humboldt County. There are quite a few now. But it was interesting. I did it because I was like, for the community, I will, right? And so I go out and I do this, and then I'm in the practicum, and then I'm picking my low hanging fruit memories, right? That they can process within that same like all of like 30 minutes. And it worked. It worked all 2 times. I think it was 3 times. Oh, well, the first time I couldn't really get like a solid memory. I thought it was solid and it wasn't. But then the other 2 times, no, it worked. Like to this day, like the one with the dog and the other one was claustrophobia. I am no longer claustrophobic. It's super weird. I can definitely now squeeze into small spaces and feel okay. And I've done it. Like I've like exposed myself to it. Getting into small cramped spaces, getting into aerial silk. That was actually why I decided to do one on claustrophobia, because I was like, couldn't get into that aerial silk. And now without like feeling nauseous. And then now I'm just like, don't even think about it. And so I'm seeing that it works. And once again, I just picked something kind of silly, because not that silly, but something easy, for them to process during the practicum.
And so you weren't even wholesale on it when
No.
you started. You're like,
No.
I'll just do this in
Yeah.
case somebody in the community wants it. And then
Right.
in going through the process of the training, you realized, oh, there might actually be something to this.
Oh yeah, I'm a total groupie.
How funny is that?
It's super funny, because I was telling my consultant that I was like, I was not on board. I thought I was joining some witchcrafty like
Some woo woo.
yeah, and then she was like, that's funny because a lot of people say that, right? Until they've done it. But most people will have done EMDR as a therapist in terms of they are a client or they were a client, and then they go and do the training. At least that was my cohort. And so that's really fascinating. And then, like I said, I was not, there was no full buy-in from me. I was like, for the community, I will. And then I go in and I'm like, nope, full board, like full buy-in at this point, And I remember when I was done with it, I was like, who can I practice on? And I was like, can I do this on myself? Like, I think there's an app for this. There is. There's like the bilateral app, as long as you have like a monitor that, there's like the bouncing ball that goes back and forth. I haven't tried it on myself yet that way, though.
And so for you I know we talked a little bit about psychedelic assisted therapy.
Mhm.
Was that kind of the same epiphany of you experienced it and then realized, oh, there might be some validity to this, or was that already on your radar?
That was on my radar already. Yeah, I definitely went in more like I was definitely all in with that already, But even with like my other modality, I'm currently in training for like neuroaffective relational model. I went through the level 1 training, which is open to really kind of the not general, I take that back, to people that aren't therapists. So like you could be a massage therapist, you could be a nurse, and you could enter this training. But level 2 all the way to 4, it's strictly for LMFTs or like marriage family therapists, licensed clinical social workers, and counselors, and psychologists. And so it was interesting that I didn't even have my complete buy-in with that. It was more like I was reading books around it. I was like, do I want to? And once again, I was like, the community does not have a NARM therapist. There's one NARM therapist. And I think Carrie Griffin, yeah, is also, she's NARM informed as well. Then I think her therapist is a NARM therapist. But, she's in her own group with her ketamine assisted therapy. And so I don't know of another NARM therapist locally. And once again, I'm only like a quarter of the way through with level 2 at this point. And so, but I did not have, I'm like, I'm paying all this money and like, I'm not even completely in, and then now recently I was like, okay, I'm in, right? It's all these practicums that we do and all these dyads and triads that I'm like, okay, you got me. Like I remember the level 1 when I was doing level 1 of neuroaffective relational model. I'm like, I don't know. And I think I just had the incorrect mindset. I was like, oh, they're doing pure NARM. They're not using other modalities within it. And they kept saying, even in level 2, they're like, no, you can add other things into it as you move about, And I was just like, this is so strict and confining and rigid. And I'm like, wait, I wasn't listening. That's what was going on. I wasn't listening that they were saying, this is what we're teaching. It's pure NARM. And it made a lot of sense when I was like, oh, got it. You're not confining me to this, right? And that's where I'm like, okay, hold on. I'm seeing this work. we're doing dyads, triads, practicums on this, and I can see the how helpful it could be, you know.
What does NARM look like in practice?
So it starts off with, what would you like for yourself in this session, or what would you like out of our time today? And from there, the idea is that it's an in-depth model where we don't really they don't really look at behaviors, more like how do we, I guess, to summarize it, it's how do we reconnect to ourselves and reconnect to our hearts. Um, and it's really sad, yet it makes a lot of sense. You know, there's a saying that they say, you know, with developmental trauma, it's like you're healing from a broken heart. And and so that's what we're doing, right? We're reconnecting to ourselves. So hopefully over time, as we process these traumas and as we figure out how to become regulated with our emotions, that, you know, really we just need ourselves to do that. You know, the supports are fantastic, of course, right? External supports such as our partners and our friends and family, that's all really important as well. But then it's really about like, how do we reconnect to ourselves? Because we already have all the resources within us. We're just not able to see it. We're not able to connect. We're not able to come home. We're not able to like reconnect with our heart at this point. And that's the idea of NARM too. It's like, but you know, between that, there's a lot of you know, exploring. It does really lift a lot of pressure off myself as a therapist because you're just being curious with the person. So for example, let's just say, you know, someone brings in, I want to explore anger. You know, that one's pretty easy, or I want to explore my depression. I'm and then you say, okay, you know, if you were less depressed, what would that bring to you? And you kind of keep asking very similar questions. As you're saying that, how do you feel about that? What are you feeling right now when you're saying that? Right. And it's kind of the same question until you can get to what's called a contract. And you might say, and then let's just say from depression, you find out it's confidence that you're seeking. And so then the contract would be, how does it sound to explore what's in the way of you feeling confident? And they say, yeah, that sounds great. And then from there, there's like another pillar. There's like, it's based off of four pillars. Right now, we've only been introduced to pillar 2. I mean, I've been introduced to all 4 because there's books on it. There's, you know, I've done level 1 training on it, but you set that contract. And then from there, you get really curious with the person in terms of somatically and also on this more kind of like question asking level, right? You deconstruct whatever it is that they're bringing into the room. You ask them more questions around it. So it is this kind of a little bit of excavation of like, give me an example of the last time you felt really confident. Let's just say we're going back to that same example, right? And then they'll say, oh, I, you know, studied a lot for my chemistry test. I felt really good. I took the test and I got an A. And then I was also really proud of myself on top of that. I felt confident and then I came out proud a week later when I got my scores, whatever it may be. And then you kind of chop that up with them to walk through that experience and you break it down. Like, what was it that made you really confident during that time? And as you're telling me about this chemistry test and you studying and you putting in that time, how does it feel right now? Right. So you're just getting into this scenario with them, like really in a deep way of breaking it down.
And how does that model differ from just, I suppose, the general questioning of regular therapy? Would you say regular therapy or just?
Well, it kind of depends on the modality again. You know, so like, for example, I think a big one that gets used a lot is cognitive behavioral therapy. So changing the way you think to change the way you feel. It's really hard to have people change their thought process, right? Like when we as people just relearn things, you know, like I'm thinking about like I always use this example. It's kind of funny where someone's like, Christopher Columbus discovered America. And then you read some books and you're like, nope, you know, everything tells you that's not true, right? And so you're like, there's that relearning, right? And so, but that one's a lot more like easy because you're like, no, these are facts now. These are facts. With the other part of when you're talking about like cognitive behavioral therapy, now you're talking about your emotions. And even though I always use the term, well, the proof is in the pudding, you're seeing this, people are telling you you're doing a good job, people still won't believe it, right? They're not relearning. They're not saying that I did a good job, even though 50 people came up to them and were like, good job on this one, I don't know, event you put on. And they're like, no, I'm terrible. You're like, what? it's just not that easy because there's like emotion involved, there's shame involved, right? There's these aren't just like these like history book facts and you're like, "Oh, let's change my thinking there." And so with CBT it is very different than like you're saying like, "Well, what's the difference with other therapies?" Right? Like then you have other ones like motivational interviewing or what else is out there right now that I can't even think about? Or IFS, parts therapy. That's another one that works on complex post traumatic stress disorder. Or there's solutions focused, right? Or gestalt therapy, all these different things out there that they all kind of have their own. It's weird because I know NARM is like, we don't really have a goal. And it's like, we don't, but we also kind of do. You have an agenda. We always have an agenda as to what it is we're working, right? Because it's a modality, it's a process. CBT has a bunch of different interventions, right? Restructuring people's thinking, right? Giving people other ideas, right? Laddering techniques of if this is true and then what? If that were true and then what? So there are a lot of similarities at the same time, but I think NARM tries to really get away from the cognitive part where they're really tapping into the somatic part of what's going on, but you're also chopping up some of your examples and experiences related to whatever issue it is you're bringing up. Like, for example, confidence, right? I was really confident here. Let's chop that up. What was that entire process? Explain it to me, right? Or there's the flip side of tell me a time when you weren't confident and you could chop that up. So you can go different ways with NARM as well. Or like I said, with IFS, that's called parts therapy. So that's way different. There's a lot of somatic work going on, but there's also a lot of cognitive work going on. Because, for example, it's the same question in IFS. What would you like for yourself today? Or how was your week going? And you might maybe bring up some things that happened this week. And then what they do, the therapist will do, is kind of look for those parts for you. Oh, I hear that there's maybe like an anger part or like an anxious part that came out, and then they'll be like, do you want to be with that part right now? And so you kind of either you sit back and you kind of get relaxed and then you kind of tap into that anxietal part. What was it trying to tell you this week or in that incident or that particular event or situation? What was it trying to tell you? Right. And then other parts might come out like, oh, I was really anxious, but then I also found out I was like angry. And then sometimes it ties into multi-generational trauma or as they call it in the IFS world, legacy trauma. And then so the idea is that we start to map and identify our parts. And then we see how all these different parts make up who we are. And then from there, you kind of start trying to regulate the parts in terms of emotions, right? If anxiety came out, let's just say we're running late, and anxiety came out and I'm like full board at a 10 out of 10. And I'm like, I'm late, right? Fumbling, purse flying everywhere kind of situation, right? Got 1,000 things in your hand along with 6 bags, right? And so I always like see that image. I'm like, wait a second, I am late, but where am I late to, right? You can now stop and say, hold on, I am late. Oh, it's my client I'm late to go see. I could probably just text my client and let them know I'm running 5 minutes behind. And that will be fine.
Crisis averted.
Yeah. And that's it, right? If I just took 3 seconds, 10 seconds to stop myself to say, why is my anxiety here? Because I'm running really late. I'm not really running that late, but let's say I'm 5 minutes late, let me just text this person. It's fine. And you're like, oh, really? That anxiety maybe needed to be at a 2 because it's all, there needs to be an alert or an alarm going off to let you know, do something about this, right? But it didn't have to be at a 10. You didn't have to try to make it there on time anymore. You just let them know I'm running late. If you have that opportunity to say I'm running late, but sometimes you also think you're running late and all of a sudden you're at a 10 and you're like, I got like 20 minutes. I'm not running late, but something internally just triggered because I'm an anxious person. Because it's at a cellular level now, right? This is where that whole idea of like panic attacks, people are just like, I don't know where it came from. Like, well, this is why it's called an attack, right? Because it comes out of nowhere. And at that point, you're talking about whatever trauma that may have taken place and now it's on a cellular level, right? Like it doesn't just sit in our brain where we're like, we can recall it and be like, oh, that was a stressful time. And then it goes away. Like over time, there's this mind-body connection that it starts to sit in our cells. And what do our cells do? They reproduce, right? They're just copies of one another. And so a lot of times you'll see that, in trauma informed therapy, they'll talk a lot about that we just don't store it in our memories at that point. It's in our bodies. This is where that mind body connection comes to play. And then there's the book, like The Body Keeps the Score, and it talks a lot about how it is that we store our trauma if we don't process it as well. Sorry, just like segued into like
No, that was a great segue.
but it's interesting though that's what trauma can do. When we look at all these different types of modalities, I don't really care what modality it is at this point. It's really kind of, as a therapist, you just choose the ones that sound correct for you. They sound good to you. And I think a lot of times people will expect, I had somebody ask me today, they're like, how long have you been doing this for? I'm like, not that long, really. I've been a psychotherapist for solidly a year and 6 months. I've been a licensed clinical social worker for 2 years. I've been a social worker with a master's degree for 12 years, though. I chose not to become licensed immediately following, and I'm glad I didn't. Actually, I'm really glad I didn't. I really do think the state needs to, like, that's a whole nother topic, but I do think the state needs to, like, maybe look at how people should not get their associate's licensure immediately following graduate school, because I think people miss out on these other things that can happen where they can integrate providing resources and therapy at the same time, especially in this community where it's so small that's almost needed. It's like there's a both and that can happen here. And and it might not be for everybody. For me, it worked out where I needed that both and, where I'm like, okay, I'm really good at crisis work, but I can also be really good at therapy. And then now I'm like, I'm getting older and maybe my body is just tired. I don't really want to do crisis work anymore. I don't want to run around town all the time. So I now want to move over here and do therapy. And as I'm doing it, I'm like, okay, I was using all these different modalities in my world of doing crisis work. What do I want to do now? Oh, it's totally different than what I was doing then. Like these new modalities that keep coming out, I'm like, oh, like I'm really interested in this direction because I've seen people, I've seen it and I have not experienced it. I've seen people suffering. I have my own suffering, but it looks very different, right? In this community, I've seen a lot of a lot of basic needs issues, with the people I've worked with, and then a lot of grief and loss, and then a lot of death and dying, and so what I've seen is very different. And then from it all, though, I'm like, what I've decided that I want is like dignity for people. That's it at the end of their life, and so if I can provide that, through this like more trauma informed care, that we can then kind of carry on our lives in a more dignified, peaceful way, even if it's just for another 5 years or 70 years. That's great. If you have more time, great. If you don't, then at least the last bits of it was good internally, and so that's the thought process that I have.
Well, yeah, and I think what's interesting about our current day and age is I think people are waking up to the idea that a lot of that can be achieved through psychedelics.
Mhm.
Is that there's this thing that on top of therapy for
Mhm.
sure can alleviate a lot of these suppressed feelings, these emotions, allow you to work through some traumatic experiences and then come out on the other side. And I don't know if you would say in a shortened time span than it would take without them, or even in some cases open a door that you wouldn't have been able to get to otherwise.
Yeah, it's the shortened time span. So when I was at Carrie Griffin's office,
Shout out to Carrie, she's
yeah,
awesome.
I know, she's
Humble
great.
Center for New Growth. Yeah.
It was interesting. And then going through my own, maybe if some of my clients see this, it's fine. I don't care. But my own psilocybin assisted therapy experience. And then going through therapy myself, I'm still in therapy, because therapists have their own things too. And so when people are like, therapists need to work out their own stuff, I'm like, you just objectified me. I'm a human being. Let me be, right? Let me be me on my personal time. But it's interesting because I have watched this, like being a therapist, being in therapy, being on psychedelics or psilocybin, and then watching, like being very lucky to go into Carrie's office and watching several sessions of IV ketamine assisted therapy. When I saw that first session of ketamine assisted therapy, I was like, whoa, okay. I'm like, this is the only way I can describe it. Talk therapy is like a brisk walk to possible processing of trauma or whatever is going on with us. Psilocybin is like a jog. That's how I felt, you know. And then there, of course, there's everything else in between. You've got LSD, you've got MDMA. I have yet to see that in a therapeutic level. I wish I can. I hope I will soon. And then I saw ketamine, and I'm like, that's like a sprint to these doors that was going to take forever for us to get there, you know? And so every time I get to collaborate, you know, with Carrie and her team, I'm like, yes. And so a lot of times I'm just guiding people as they're going through it, like in my own office. And then so then you could line up a bunch of other things or do it at the same time too, to be like, ooh, okay, hold on. Is it a good time right now to do EMDR while they're in the midst of ketamine, right? Do I wait? And you can gauge that a little bit. You can also ask the client and they'll be like, yeah, let's wait. Let's do one thing at a time. I'm like, great, you know, because then things are coming up and people are like willing and more emotionally capable to confront these issues, the trauma, whatever it may be, shame that's coming up.
And more self-aware
Oh,
in a
yeah.
number of different ways.
Right. That's the best part, that recognition. You know, when that recognition comes, I'm just like, I feel like I've won the lottery. And it's not even about me, right? It's not about me at all. And I'm just like, okay, wow, we got there. But I've noticed with, you know, psychedelic assisted therapy, you get there so much faster with that recognition because people will kind of like jog around the recognition of whatever issue it may be or patterns it may be, and they're going to bring it up for 6 months. But once again, it's like they know it, but they don't know it, right? And then so when I see that switch, I'm like, oh, you know it, you know. And I'll say that, and people are like, yeah, I think I know it now, you know. And I'm like, no, but you know it. And they're like, yeah, I do. And then they're like, okay, I'm exhausted now, or they're like, I'm not feeling so well because I just
I went through that.
Yeah, I just went through it, and now I know, right? And those are like really great moments. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is why I do the work I do. This is why I keep wanting to learn these different modalities that come out, right? Or I want to try it for myself, and then I want to go and get the training for it, and then I want to give it to the community, because there is like a, you know, there's just so many things out there for behavioral health at this point, and it's a very exciting time. At least I feel it is. You know, I don't know if other therapists think the same, but maybe it's just like because I'm like nerding out on it recently, you know, but I'm just like, I love it. I do. And I'm glad that I went the route of licensure now. I wouldn't have changed it, you know, for really anything at that point. I'm like, yeah, I did what I did and that's okay, you know, because I feel like I've honed into like the modalities that I want to be trained in to hopefully, you know, help people here in this community because we have really high ACEs scores here in this community. I think we're second. The last time, I forget what research group it was I looked through, it was in San Francisco. And there was they did publish for the 54 counties, right? That's how many counties we have? 54? Yeah. In California? Yeah. Okay. But we were number 2 when it came to ACEs scores. So we had some of the highest adverse childhood experiences score. I think the number 1 might have been Butte County, I want to say, somewhere in the valley. I can't quite remember right now, but Mendocino and Humboldt County, top 2, you know, with having adverse childhood experiences. So once again, parents incarcerated, right? Sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, death of a family member, all these different things, these 10 categories that they've, you know, lumped it all into for an ACE score.
Which is crazy because we're not a very big county.
No. What are we, 134,000 people, right? I think, yeah. And so that's a lot of people.
It's a lot of trauma.
Yeah. I forget the actual breakdown right now because they ended up breaking it down to like by the age and by the ACE score. And I kind of remember right now off the top of my head, I could, you know, don't quote me on this. I could find the research because I, you know, used it as a reference for something. But I think it was 75% of the adults here in Humboldt County at least has a ACE score 4 or more, just the adult part. And then I forget about the children right now. So they broke it up with an age, like I said, and then the amount of the scores itself.
And I'm not I'm familiar with ACEs, I'm not that well versed on it.
Mhm.
Are Is it a weighted system across the board where each thing is just, like, checking a box? And so, "Oh, you've
Uh-huh.
got this," and then that's how we tally it up?
Yeah, yeah,
So a
it's just like
death of
mhm.
a family member is the same as, like, being abused?
Yeah, yeah, it's
Okay.
just like 1, basically.
You just check that box.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I think it was I forget, developed maybe in the early 2000s in down in San Diego in Kaiser, and so that's, I forget how they even came about it, some sort of research, but it makes a lot of sense, and once again, now it's being looked at with EMDR when you do, a history taking before you do the assessment, right? That you're like, "Oh, hold on, we're trying to hone in on what are some of these issues that had happened in, your childhood," which is developmental trauma at that point.
Well, when you experience something as a child, it's a lot more challenging, I would imagine, to unpack because you were just so susceptible to things because you haven't lived enough life, you don't have
Mhm.
enough experience, you haven't kind of gone through the motions in a lot of ways, and so when you're hit with some challenging times as a child, it's almost like, obviously, your world is falling apart because that's your world, and
Right,
each day is an eternity, and to go through something as a kid, you just the sky is falling.
right, and then you start taking it out on yourself, right? And this is where you get the shame part, right? And because there's so many people that live with shame that I see that I'm like, "Oh, it's thick and it's real." It's everywhere I go. And I also see, like, a lot of themes going on. There's weekly themes as well. It's very strange how the world works, or I don't know I don't know. I don't I get it. I might get, like, kind of, like, all weird and, like, sometimes I'm like, "Oh, is, like, Libra in retrograde," right? Because when I used to work in adult protective services, you would get these calls that were like, "Someone stole my gold coins," and I'm like, "What?" And then you would get another one. "I had these gold coins and it was stolen." I'm like, "Someone prank calling me?" And I'd look and I'm like, "That's a totally different number," right? Or you'd have themes about bears. "Oh my gosh, there's bears everywhere." I'm like, "Why are we getting calls here about bears?" Right? But same as like, in my therapy, I'm like, I feel like I said this already 25 times this week. And then I look back and I'm like, yeah, I said it about 15 times. Because I'll look back in my notes and I'm like, wow, it's the same thing that I said. It's the same theme that came up this week, And it's really interesting how, you know, common we are and how similar we are in terms of like things that we go through. I mean, there's a lot of like right now, even myself, there's seasonal affective disorder, right? I know that there's a saying that it's like only strangers talk about the weather. I'm like, yeah, unless you live in Humboldt County, and we've only had 200 and I guess they hadn't counted it today or yesterday, but I think read the Lost Coast Outpost and they were like, we've only had 209 hours of sun since January 1st to like June like 28th at 1 p.m. or something. And I'm like,
That's crazy.
yeah. And it was like 700 some odd hours of overcast.
Well, that's one of those temporary depressive aspects is seasonal depression
Yeah. Mhm.
because you're just not getting enough sun,
Yeah.
and so you feel a little gloomy.
Right. Which is another really big thing here in Humboldt County. I know we joke about vitamin D deficiency. Oh, like usually I'm like, please go get a set of labs. Like, please talk to your doctor. When I used to, work with a medical team, it was easier when I'm like, oh, they might need a panel with like vitamin D included. Oh yeah. And you don't know how many people that come back to me that are like, so I'm on these massive horse pills for vitamin D. And they're actually prescribed, right? It's not I went to Costco and got it over the counter. A lot of people are like, I have to take this like 13-week course. I have to take this 6-week course. I have to take this whatever course. And then I have to go and do the supplements because, and then guess what? Vitamin D deficiency leads to depressive symptoms.
Shocker.
Yeah, right? So there's also that, right? And so there are a lot of different things that are happening here in Humboldt where I'm like, okay, there's the high ACEs score, there's the lack of sun, right? And sometimes you're like, which one is it?
Yeah,
And
chicken or the egg type
yeah.
situation.
And then sometimes you're like, oh, it's a little bit of both, And then also another thing I was thinking about earlier, I forgot what we were talking about, but people who have also been it's really interesting watching people process their own trauma, especially older people who maybe had, let's just say, depression from whatever trauma it was that they've experienced as a kid or a young adult, and then they process it. And then they age and then their bodies start to change. And guess what happens? Well, we need more rest, right? Like, I mean, I could tell, like, I'm not no longer, I think back 20 years ago, I was like, no, I could just keep going. It's 4 a.m. I'm still going, right? I'm like typing a paper, I'm doing whatever. But it's interesting because now you've got, at least I'm thinking about my aging population people, they can't decipher depression from tiredness now because they've been going for so long that all of a sudden they're like, what do you mean my body is aging? And then I'm like, wait, time out. Is this depression or is this you're exhausted because you work harder than I do? In terms of manual labor, right? That I hear people going out there and they're like, oh, I worked like a 10-hour day today, mowing a lawn and working on someone's like landscaping or whatever. And I'm like, no wonder you're sleeping for like 2 days, right? No wonder you're out because you're not, you know, 25 working on someone's lawn for 10 hours. You're 72 doing this work, right?
Well, and then even counter that with the opposite spectrum of I only got 5 hours of sleep and I
Right.
was doing all that.
Right.
And that's just how I've been going for the past X number of years.
Right. And then so I get people that come in and they're like, I think I'm depressed. And they tell me about it. And I'm like, and then you start having to excavate. You're like, wait, hold on. And so now there's more insight. You're like, tired versus depressed. Let's talk about this, right? And then you find out you're like, not depressed, exhausted, right? And so you're like, okay, you're like, those are easier in the sense that you're like, okay, that one was kind of fast and the therapy sessions may not last as long, but it's interesting to watch that as well when people have processed their trauma or they have secure attachments from childhood. And that's with the aging population, and we're all the aging population because we're constantly aging. Like I could tell, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I can't do that. Like I've come to terms with it already, and I think I kind of have that. Like I feel like maybe I have a little bit of like a step up because I've worked with so many aging people. And this is why I'm like, oh, I've had advanced directive. Oh, I know what tired looks like now, right? Oh, I got this, right? And so it's been interesting to watch that too. How when we think we're depressed, but we're really tired, that then it could lead to anxiety. And then now you've really kind of created a little bit of a monster in terms of now I'm really anxious because I think I'm depressed, or I'm anxious, and then it causes depression, right? Because I thought I think I'm doing too much, right? And so there's that where it's fascinating where we kind of like, I guess it's still kind of dysregulation at that point, that still needs to be worked through. But the therapy looks very different. I wouldn't take I wouldn't do EMDR for them. I wouldn't do NARM for them. I wouldn't do, so it's interesting where then you kind of go back to the what would be called quote unquote the basics of CBT at that point, cognitive behavioral therapy. Right. That part really is like changing the way you think to change the way you feel at that point. I can't change the tiredness. You just have to rest. But the way you think, at least, is that I think you're exhausted when you tell me about your day, And so it's interesting, like, once again, the modalities you pick out to use based on what people are bringing in. And then there has to be a lot of investigating around it as well, because people come in with something and then you're like, is it? Usually off the bat, you want to be like, it is. And then you're like, hold on, no, this may not be it. So it's, yeah. And we're so complex, but so similar. It's fascinating that like, I'm very lucky to get to like talk to people all day long and, and I'm like, oh, like we're not very different. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't really have a lot it's like, people are like, is that all you have to say about it, about that, about your job? I'm like, yeah, but it's like a little bit of a conundrum in my head. Like I'm trying to process it, that I'm like, oh, this is, we're not so different. And I really hope people understand that, because sometimes it is pretty heartbreaking when people come in and they take their difference or like, and they really kind of shame themselves with it, and I'm like, wait, hold on, you're not that different, and or people will ask for validation. I just need validation that I'm not going crazy. I'm like, because you're not, and I'm like, wow, like, did someone never tell you that other people have anxiety too? And a lot of times, there's a lot of humor in my therapy, so I'm always like, well, why do you think there's these breathing exercises? Why do you think the word anxiety is around? because it happens to other people, right? And people are like, yeah, I didn't think about it like that, or they're just like, I had a panic attack. And I'm like, well, it's an attack. I mean, I don't believe you can schedule one in. You
Yeah.
can like a pencil. Let me
I've got too much
pencil.
going on today.
Yeah.
I can't do this right now.
Right. Right. And so it's really interesting that validation is also really needed, even though there are these words: depression, rage, anger, anxiety, and people are like, I think I'm going crazy because I have this. I'm like, no, you don't. It's a word. It's been a word. This is not new, right? We didn't just make this word up for you right now. And people are like, oh, okay. And so you could go from there and be like, all right, now let's talk about the anxiety itself and where the difficulty of regulation is again, you know? So yeah, it's like I said, very interesting field that I never thought I was gonna be in as a child.
Funny how life works out like that
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. Did not think I was gonna be doing anything close to this, actually. So but I'm glad I'm doing it. I'm glad I'm in this community doing it too. I think we really need it here, and I think this is like a very special place in terms of just, where the ocean meets like the redwoods, and it's hard to get up here, which is great. Right? I love it. I'm like, "God, you can't get up here. Okay, great. You can't come in." And but then it is, it's special, but it's also difficult for people to come up here, which means that we have not a lot of services. And services are difficult, and thank goodness there's some things out of COVID that I will say thank goodness for COVID, which is telehealth. It's really opened things up for people to see their doctors in San Francisco without always going down there now, right? Or seeing a therapist that specializes in something, because we don't have it here in Humboldt County. My therapist is in Utah, and so I'm lucky that I can go and seek out therapy elsewhere because we don't have that many people that does internal family systems here, right? And this is why I'm choosing to do EMDR. This is why I'm choosing to do NARM. Also, it piques my interest, but at the same time, I'm like, there's all these cutting edge stuff that we don't get because we're not the big city, because it's remote and it takes a certain kind of people to live here. It really does.
Yeah, that's the challenge in being landlocked in the sense that we are, is that access to just good healthcare in general it can be challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see that, on a daily basis. I hear about a lot of people and their medical stressors in terms of not really, when I say medical stressor, not like I have this diagnosis or it's always about I couldn't get into my doctor's office. The office receptionist was really rude to me, whatever it may be, because we're so impacted here, and I get it. I mean, I've worked for, you know, a couple of clinics here, and I see it. I just got cut from my primary care, and I'm like, I can't even be mad at you. I'll just go somewhere else, and I get it. It's just like, what else do I do? Pay out of pocket or go somewhere else? But going somewhere else is really hard too. You call 10 numbers and they're like, nope.
Not accepting new patients.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're like, okay, I'll go to Sohum. Just go to Sohum. That's fine. I'll just do that. And so, like I said, there's a lot of medical stressors in the sense of like logistics here that sometimes people will spend like 20 minutes telling me about it. And I'm like, I know, right? What else can we do about it though? Right? And I don't know what we can do about it because there's not enough doctors, there's not enough nurses, there's not enough therapists. And that's the not enough is also, I feel like at times are also in the big city, depending on what we're looking for. I think I told you at the beginning of this, I'm like, I'm really surprised I have a couple people that I see telehealth wise, in terms of taking a few hours out of what could be given back to this community. I give it to people in larger cities. And I'm like, this is really interesting that you're going from a bigger city looking, in a remote place for a therapist, because they're like, yeah, because you have some of these things that I'm looking for. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. But there's also a lot of therapists out there that, that I do very similar modalities to them, then I'm like, what, there's this person. But then sometimes people are like, no, we're looking for like an Asian American person. I'm looking for a first generation, a child of immigrants, and so they're looking for that piece of relating at that point, which I'm like, oh, okay, I could see that, and so I'm like, oh, I might actually be one of the few. I think, in fact, I might be the only one in terms of like Humboldt County and first generation children of immigrants, because there's a huge college population up here. And I was like, I need to start doing that. I need to start going back, and not only strictly sticking with the population I'm completely comfortable with. Like, I'm very comfortable with people who have gone through my own experiences too. So that's,
well, and you're very easy to talk to, which I think is a very important thing when you're looking for a therapist is, do I feel comfortable talking with this person? Can I go to these places with them that I might be challenging for me? And I think you have that. I think you're easy to talk to, and I could see people saying, well, I want you because I know I can talk to you. I'm
yeah.
not going to be freaked out. We can have these difficult discussions. We can go to these challenging places, and it's going to be okay.
Yeah, and I think, and I do think that, maybe it's because I use a lot of humor appropriately.
Probably helps. Yeah.
Sometimes inappropriately, but people appreciate it, right? I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at the absurdity of things, right? And people are like, yeah, and there's really nothing we could do but laugh. And so sometimes it's like, there is a lot of laughing that goes on. When I used to work at a clinic here, in fact, I just ran into this person yesterday. My coworker who worked outside of my office was like, why is it always so loud in there? What's going on? I'm like, yeah, there's just a lot of laughing going on because sometimes that's all we can do, right? And then we kind of get out of it, and then next there could be like crying going on, and I'm like, yeah, we're feeling all of our range of emotions here, right? We're going through it all, not all of them, but we're going through quite a few of them, And once again, it's just like you're just being human. That's it. It's just a reminder. Be like, we can do hard things. That's it. And we can do it with that, self-compassion piece too, right? Because, I've talked about a lot of other modalities, but there's a really big one that I use too. And it's not even a modality. It's more like skills-based. It's self-compassion. It's been around for about 25 years or so, I think, maybe 25, 30 years. Started in Berkeley with a woman named Kristen Neff, who now teaches at the University of Texas. And then her and her co-founder, Chris Germer, they do a lot of these trainings on self-compassion of like how to be kind to self. That whole idea of being kind to self would then radiate more compassion to our community and, our neighbors, whatever it may be. And so there's a lot of like skills building with self-compassion too. And that's a difficult one to get
It's
through.
a lifelong challenge.
Yeah.
Working through that and just
Right.
being more compassionate towards yourself.
Right. Yeah. And that kindness to self, which then works through shame, right? Because there's a training that they have called the antidote to shame is self-compassion, which I'm like, yeah, it totally is. You are correct. And I've been trying to get into that training as well, but I just have no time. I'm like completely booked up with until like the spring. And I think that's another thing that clients do appreciate. They're like, you're always telling me about these new things you're trying to learn, right? And once again, it's like you don't have all the answers. I'm like, yeah, because I don't have any answers at all, right? But what it is, it's like you're willing to do the work to guide people. So it's not just I as the client need to do the work, but as the therapist, you're willing to do the work that can guide us. And I'm like, that's really I appreciate that. I just thought I was over here like building up my knowledge base, and I'm like, whoa, and spending a bunch of money, but it's more than that, right? To hear people give that appreciation, to hear them ask me like, what are you learning about now? What books are you reading now is really great because people are trying to work through it. They're like, what do you know that I don't know that I can learn, and so I'm always reading some kind of behavioral health book, and so people get very interested and they're like, okay. And I'm like, yeah, sorry, I don't have that as a hard copy book because I'm I don't want to spend the money on it. And so I use Libby, right? And I go down to San Francisco and I'm like, I must get a library card from you. And you have to show up in person when you live out of the county. But I recently got one from Sacramento. So I'm like, okay, that's good enough. I'm waiting to go down to LA to get the next one to be like, and then like all the books on behavioral health I can have, so it is a lot of work for the client and then for the therapist. But I think it's really good work because it's, you're building this trusting relationship where people can come in and once again, display all the emotions. And then you kind of go through the emotions with them as well. Whether you want to like sit there and analyze it and break it down and talk about dysregulation, regulation, whatever it may be. So it's all very like present and real, but also we can take you back into history if we need to understand, right? Because we have a lot of, there's a lot of, I also see a lot of anger and resentment with parents, right? Of course, like, oh, my parents, I know, right? And then you're like, hold on, time out. Again, let's ask what happened to them. It doesn't excuse their behaviors whatsoever in terms of what happened to us because of someone else's behaviors or whatever survival situation was going on, right? It, once again, does not excuse anyone's behaviors, but what it is it gives us a better understanding of what they had to go through to get us to where we're at, and then we're having to go through whatever it is to then carry on this next generation, right?
Well, Shin, I think we can end it there.
Yeah.
This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me. Do you want to plug your stuff, where people can find you, where they can reach out if they want more information, anything like that?
Yeah, so you can either find me on the NCAMP website. What is that? What is the website? Like,
I can put it in the description,
okay.
That's actually how I found you. We were talking about that too. That was the website that you came across my radar on.
Or just real quickly, I could put my phone number out there, my work number. It's textable, even though my voicemail greeting is a little rude right now.
This does go out. Is that like a business line? I don't know.
It is a business line.
Okay, I was going to say, I don't know if you want to put out your personal line.
No.
People.
It's a business line. So people can text me on this line. I'm a lot more responsive, but it's area code 707-740-1305. It's on the NCAMP site, but that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. And then I think through NCAMP, you can email me as well. But that's the quick response.
Okay. Well, really, this was great.
Good.
We'll have to do this again. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.